Welcome to another episode where you answer your questions related to test automation. And today's question is from Parveen, and it's a very good question, but rather lengthy. But I'll read the whole thing so you have an idea of the question. We are moving from a monolithic to a microservices architecture for a new application. I'm a senior test engineer, so I'm trying to plan a strategy for testing. I've gone through a number of articles and videos and trying to get my concept clear. I'm not sure 100% about this, but this is my initial structure. Unit testing being done by the devs, and I would be aware of the tests they are running. Integration tests again done by devs, and the UI end-to-end test is going to be done by the testers. We are also implementing a CI pipeline where I would include certain tests for acceptance of the build and future testing, which is going to be automated. Once it passes acceptance tests, then we would carry out exploratory and UI testing. Please correct me, these are just my thoughts from the understanding of microservices. I'm a bit confused about when and where would regression testing fit in. So till now the questions we have are they're planning to do acceptance tests, and then they'll do the manual testing and automation testing in their routine sprint cycles, and their focus will be on so the exploratory and UI testing would be done manually, and the automation is focused on what he calls UI end-to-end tests. And then she says that where would regression testing fit in? The question goes on to ask, when we say end-to-end test, would it need to run in each sprint or each release? What would end-to-end test involve? Testing entire module on its own or all other modules it's dependent on as well? I would say module, we would be working on building each module at a time, breaking the entire product into different functionalities of modules, which is what microservices is. Very long message. Please let me know if this made any sense. Thanks, Praveen. All right, so this was the question. It is a long one, but it's a very good question. And I think a lot of slowly but surely, which is the right path, companies are going towards creating microservices based architectures, which is the next evolution in the development of software. And as testers, it definitely poses some challenges, but to begin with, I feel it would be make things more easier for testers than it would be it would be more easier than before. So first off, just to give an idea of monolithic and microservices in case you haven't come across the terms before. A monolithic application would be where there is one main web service which is providing the required business logic to the front end, and it's just one single web service which includes all the functionality, and it's not modularized at that level. At the business layer, definitely there would be modules within the business layer, but at the web service layer there are no modules. So, but a microservice is where you would divide your complete backend into different microservices, is what they call them. So instead of one big web service, if your backend, for instance, had three main features, let's take that as an example. So a microservice application would have three separate web services, and each of them dealing just the one specific functionality. For a monolithic application, there would be one main web service which would include which would be serving all these three functionalities. So now when you move from a monolithic application to a microservice based architecture, I think it makes them more testable. Testability increases because that makes, it makes more sense for API testing, and the functionalities are divided within the architecture distinctly in under different microservices, and they are more approachable, or more easily understandable, because that's the way they are designed. So the questions that we have, what makes them more testable, have tests around each microservice. So to her question of how to test microservices, yes, the way I would go around it is you would have tests for each microservice, and then you would have what you call integration tests. So now she says that the integration tests are being put off to the development team. I mean, you can do that, but I'd rather argue that if you do have those unit tests, you could very easily, handle those unit tests, or sorry, you could handle those integration tests yourselves, because when you test one API or one microservice, then you can, test the other microservices as well alongside. So, and you can have integration tests among those. So definitely, yes, test one microservice individually, and then you would have integration tests which would test each microservice, test the microservice with integration one by one, because that's how eventually when these are served to the front end, so the tool which is orchestrating these microservices is going to keep a watch on which microservices are being requested, and what microservices need to be served to the request which is being sent by the front end. So yes, microservice individual tests for each microservice, integration tests, and it should be done by the automation team with in collaboration with the development. That's the ideal case usually that I recommend. And also with microservices, you would, so the way they work is another aspect which I didn't mention earlier. For instance, functionality A of our application has a microservice, and there's a microservice for functionality A, and one microservice can handle, let's say, 20 requests at a time. That's an arbitrary number. Now, as soon as we move forward, so if there are more than 20 requests for that functionality, the orchestration tool, let's say Kubernetes in this case, so Kubernetes would request, would create another microservice right at that point, and to serve the 21st request for that functionality. So you see, as requests keep piling up for that microservice, you keep adding new microservices to create copies of that microservice to serve them. And when, as the demand goes down, you keep, you can destroy your microservices to the level as to what you need. So that's the idea of one of the how microservices work. So, and this is a this should be a standard test of, in automation, where you are testing the load of your how the orchestration is responding to different loads, request stress testing or load testing from your API, from your front end application. So if, as we climb or add more requests for a specific microservice, are we getting these duplicated microservices? Are they being orchestrated in a fashion that we are not seeing an effect on the UI level? And once we do, once the requests come down, are we getting rid of the microservices that are not used anymore? So that's something, along, and it would be easier if you already have these tests in place, unit tests for each microservice, or API tests for each microservice, and sort of an integration between microservices, you can easily add these tests as well. Also, I'd like to add here that API tests are really easier than UI tests, especially for such an application. So I would emphasize more on API tests than on UI tests. And again, the automation pyramid. So you would like to do that anyway. There was a question about acceptance tests only, and automating. From what I understood, they're automating just acceptance tests only. So I think automation should not just focus on acceptance tests. Rather, anything that would be a mundane activity on the tester's side, it should be automated. In our case, we discussed already that API tests is one such area. You can also add other tests. You should not confine yourself to just acceptance testing, and there could be a number of ways how you can add acceptance. Even if for acceptance testing there would be at different levels, you would have tests at UI level and the API level, and you already have unit level as well. So automation should not just, you can expand your focus on more than acceptance tests and not get stuck with just we have to do acceptance tests and everything else has to be done by the developers. Now, where does regression fit? That was another question there. So ideally, regression, whenever you are about to release something, you want that confidence that the application is performing as it's supposed to, right? So ideally, regression should be whenever you are, every time before you are releasing. And then if you do it just before releasing the complete regression, sometimes you might come across an issue which would be at the 11th hour, and you might not be able to fix it in time. So then we'd say that try to do regression a bit earlier, not just when you're about to release. Ideally, I'd say this all boils down to how much computation power you have for executing your automation suite. If you can afford to run your automation rather sooner or in closer intervals, including regression, and it's not a burden, and it does add value to your tests, that's important. Then I would recommend that doing it more often. If not, try to hit at least once per release. And even if that's not possible, then you could decide at an interval of like a quarterly or something, but do have regression as soon as you can, because that's the real value of automation. That tests which usually we don't have, or checks which we usually don't have time to go through, automation can do that. And I try to, if you have those tests in place, just try to add that computation power there. It doesn't take much in these days to add that level of support in there. It's rather easy. So that's the where does regression test fit. Strictly speaking, regression is obviously before every release. You should have regression before every release. That's just the default answer. And for automation, we discussed, as we discussed, as soon as you can do it. Last point I'd like to make here is end-to-end. This term end-to-end is rather ambiguous, and it's used, different people use it with different meanings. So end-to-end can also mean that we are testing from the UI level of the application back to the database level. So it's end-to-end of the technology stack. So you start from the UI, API, and the database level. So this is the end-to-end from the technology stack, from the top till the bottom. Now that's one interpretation of end-to-end. And the other end-to-end, usually the way it's taken by most people is, by end-to-end they mean from a use case, from the start of one use case till the end of that use case. So one complete user transaction is what they call an end-to-end. Um, so I usually try to refrain from the word end-to-end because it has, it's ambiguous, and sometimes we're not sure what they're really talking about. So I'll talk about both of them. So if you meant end-to-end as by the technology stack, you should definitely have tests on all those levels. We've discussed that. And if you're talking about a complete use case from one end to the other, so generally I've seen some tests where the use case would start from step one and 1, 2, 3, 4 and 20, 40, and I don't know, it can be 60 screens long, and it's a long test which is going through all these steps just to try one use case. I'd recommend that don't go through the whole use case in one test. Break it down into multiple use cases, into multiple tests, and execute it that way. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, add them in the comments below. If you find this video useful, please don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel to join us in redefining software quality. See you next time.